Why would early Christians write a Gospel of Judas in the first place? Jerusalem, about 100 AD. In the century after Christ's death, the Roman-ruled city is a place of intense religious ferment. Judaism, Roman cults, and Christian groups all compete for followers. But one religion is about to break from the pack: Christianity. This period of early Christianity wasn't what most people think. There was no Christian Bible. Instead, different versions of Christ's story were passed from one Christian to another. Eventually, the stories were written in the Gospels, but not until 30 to 60 years after Christ's death. And today, most scholars believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John died long before their Gospels were written.
One of the interesting phenomena from early Christianity is that the four Gospels that made it into the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all anonymous. The titles were added by later editors. They weren't written there by the authors themselves.
And there's another surprising twist to the story of the faith in the early centuries. There weren't just 4 Gospels. There were more than 30.
A gospel means the good news. So the question is, who is Jesus and what is the good news about him? Very many people saw that question in different ways.
In the first 200 years after Christ's death, literally dozens of different and sometimes conflicting versions of his life and message circulated. One of them was the Gospel of Judas.
This text, like many other texts recently discovered at Nag Hammadi, gives us a look into kinds of Christianity we'd never seen before. Many people had thought that the only Gospels there were the Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But actually, there were many more than that. There might have been dozens, like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, just to mention a few. There wasn't one early Christianity, there were many.
One faith or many, Christianity grew explosively, from Jerusalem to Asia Minor and Egypt, Rome and North Africa. There were no churches yet. Instead, followers met in private homes, where some heard Gospels named for people that would surprise most churchgoers today.
Some used Philip, some used Thomas, some used the Gospel of Mary. Others used Matthew or Mark or Luke or John.
Some of the early Christians are now called Gnostics, or the people who know.
The Gnostics were mystics. That is to say, they were people that felt they could have some kind of direct access to God. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But this kind of knowledge is not everyday knowledge. It is not book learning. It is insight. It is intuition. It is that ability to know something about yourself, to know that you have a spark of the divine inside of you, and to recognize the God that you profess to be, the God that is outside, is the same as that spark of the divine that is within you. And many of the Gnostics were Christians.
Gnostics are the people who wrote most of the texts known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Their stories about Christ are much more abstract and philosophical than those of the New Testament. One favorite was the Gospel of Thomas.
Kihi vasiliatu thiu entos human estikaktos hos an hefton noin taften hevrisi kihot humis heftus nain susite ethisite hoti hu este humis tu patros tut sontos.
When some of us were in graduate school and we first got to know these other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, we were told, well, these are Gnostic, these are heretical, these are weird and strange. We were told that Gnostics means, you know, people who are basically wrong. And this is sort of like in the 1940s and 50s in this country, you talk about the communists. And that's a way of dismissing them. So Gnostic is a term like that. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Christians.
Early church fathers fought against the Gnostics.
One of the difficulties that the Gnostics presented for people in the emerging Orthodox Church was the fact that Gnostics didn't need to have the advice and the control and the insight that came from the priests and the bishops. They had that insight in themselves, and that bothered the church leaders.
That's not all that irritated church leaders. The Gnostics also preached that the body was a prison for the divine spirit within. To them, Jesus' death was a good thing. In fact, that's one reason experts think the Gospel of Judas was written by Gnostics.
The Gospel of Judas turns Judas's act of betrayal into an act of obedience. The sacrifice of Jesus' body of flesh, in fact, becomes saving. And so for that reason, Judas emerges as the champion, and he ends up being envied and even cursed and resented by the other disciples.
Judas wasn't the only Bible character the Gnostics saw differently.
The Gnostics were convinced that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was a good figure. In fact, the Gnostics turned the story of the Garden of Eden upside down, because the serpent was a rather engaging character. After all, the serpent said to Eve, "Take some of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And to Gnostics, that sounded like a wonderful invitation. Wouldn't you like to have a bite of an apple of knowledge and have all the juice of knowledge in your being?
But ideas like this were just too shocking for early church leaders. They rejected roughly 30 Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Judas, and kept them out of the New Testament. How did church leaders decide what to keep in and what to throw out? The process took hundreds of years, but it got a critical jump start in 180 AD, and it was born in blood.